So this is kind of the structure of our talk, and we're going to try not to talk for too long because we want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion about these topics. So I'll basically introduce you to what CRISPR gene editing is and how potentially CRISPR could be used. And then Montag is going to take us into what people think about gene editing and how we can ethically think about gene editing as well. So with that said, CRISPR actually stands for clustered, regularly interspersed, short palindromic repeats. Okay, and it's a method of genetic engineering, and it's definitely going to get the Nobel Prize. And it's going to revolutionize our ability to treat human disease, which generally I think people in most respects don't have a problem with that aspect of CRISPR. So I'm going to show you guys a short YouTube video on how CRISPR works, and it is very short. It doesn't go into a whole lot of biology details. Okay.
So CRISPR is basically a group of molecules that can edit DNA. You can basically fine-tune them to just go after any piece of DNA you want. They can cut that DNA, and then you can actually insert a different piece of DNA in its place. So this could allow you, for example, to fix a defective gene. If somebody has cystic fibrosis, for example. In theory, you could use CRISPR to repair the gene that's faulty in them, and then they would not suffer from cystic fibrosis any longer. And also against things like cancer, because you can actually take people's own immune cells and edit their genes so that they can recognize and attack cancer cells. It's different from how GMOs are often created, where you're taking an existing gene from another species and you're inserting it into another species. In this case, you can just say, you know, this particular piece of DNA, I don't like it so much, I just want to change it a little bit, and you can make that precise change. And CRISPR actually lets you make many different changes to an organism's DNA, so you can create a whole suite of changes and potentially radically change that organism.
So let me give you guys some examples. So scientists are already working on trying to use this to treat diseases, and of course they're starting off in animal models. And so a couple of years back, they started to use gene editing to see if they could cure a mouse model of muscular dystrophy. And the idea is that you send in the CRISPR technology to the muscles where the problem is, and then the CRISPR technology fixes the DNA in the muscle cells, and then you've hopefully cured the animal. And just this past summer, they also tried this out in dogs, so a larger animal model, and seemed to get it to work in dogs. So potential uses of CRISPR is that you could maybe fix a gene in just one tissue. Okay, so the cystic fibrosis gene that causes lung tissue to not be able to function very well, and that's the main problem in people with cystic fibrosis. You could potentially target the lungs, fix that defective gene, and give people the ability to basically get over some of the major problems with cystic fibrosis or muscular dystrophy in muscles. So the idea of targeting genes in specific tissues is not particularly controversial. Where it gets controversial is talking about some of the other potential uses of CRISPR. So for example, it turns out that some people naturally have a defective gene, and so they have naturally very low levels of cholesterol. And so these people exist already. We know that it's safe for people to not have this gene functioning, and it turns out that they have low cholesterol because of that. So people are talking about the idea of, well, could we potentially wipe out most causes of heart disease by basically deleting that gene in the liver of all adults? So again, target CRISPR to the liver, take out that gene function, and it would kind of be like a vaccine against high cholesterol. So you'd pretty much get it once in your life. Your liver cells would no longer make that protein, and then you would no longer have high cholesterol. Okay? So, so that's a little bit different than just targeting a disease, right? Because now you're talking about potentially targeting all adults with this technology. So we can discuss the implications of that. And then we can go on quite far with this technology. So there are certain diseases, for example, that start to affect babies in utero. So could we target those babies in utero to potentially fix the disease so that they are not born with the manifestations of that disease, that you can cure them as they're developing in utero? So that's one possible application. Another possible application is for people undergoing in vitro fertilization. If they have a disease that runs in their family, then you could potentially take that fertilized embryo before it grows and correct a genetic defect. So in that case, what you would be doing is you would be changing someone's genome for the rest of their life, and also their ability to pass down that gene on to their descendants. So you'd be fixing the gene forever in them and their whole line of descendants. So really changing the human genome. So if you do that for correcting a disease, it could potentially also be used on embryos for genetic enhancement. So this is the news that came out of China just this week, that twin baby girls were born using CRISPR technology. And what they did for those twin baby girls was they removed a gene that seems to be, as far as we can tell, it's not necessary for life because people live normally without this protein there. But what it does is it, for the most part, prevents them from being able to be infected by HIV. So that's kind of a genetic enhancement. It kind of crosses the line into that territory because there are other ways that you can protect yourself from HIV. You don't necessarily have to do it genetically. And then, so everything I've talked about so far is mostly on humans. But for example, we can also start using it on other organisms. So for example, we could potentially use it on mosquitoes to kill the mosquitoes that cause malaria. And this technology is actually quite far advanced and is going to be run in certain trials on certain isolated islands. So this is very close to being realized here if we want to go in that direction. So are there any clarifying questions on any of this before I turn it over? Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Okay, cool. Well, I would like to thank Dr. Page for setting us up with all of this cool information. I think when we hear about this kind of technology, I even heard a few little whispers along the way. People say like, cool, 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 cool. And I guess it's my job now to be like, well, here are the problems. No, not exactly, but sort of. As you noticed, these questions are all should questions, and they're ultimately questions that point to ethics. You know, how ought we live? What ought we to do? And ultimately, it comes back to, you know, what can human beings do and be in this world? There are common modes of ethical inquiry that exist that tend to shape the way we frame our questions, whether we're aware of that or not. For those of you who have taken an ethics course here, whether it was in the Gen Ed curriculum or perhaps part of your major, you probably encountered various forms of ethical theory. I'm not going to go in depth on this right here, but I do want to present it so that if we do have questions about what to do with this kind of stuff, later we can actually dialogue on that. But often you find a turn towards utilitarian ethics, which really has the goal of making the most people the most happy, would be the simplest way to put that. There are certainly nuances in utilitarian ethics, but the way we tend to frame our questions, and even sometimes when we ask, well, who can this benefit? What is the proportion of successful procedures? Those kinds of things, something at the heart of that is a question about whether or not this is going to be beneficial for the greatest amount of people, and if it will bring the greatest amount of happiness to the greatest amount of people. Or will it just lead to more complications, like that sort of thing? And that's very much focused on the consequences, the results. Other forms of ethics are not as concerned with the consequences and much more concerned with intentions or motives. There you would connect a little bit more with the deontological ethical framework. This really seeks to take actions in ways that can be considered good, regardless of what the results are. What matters is that the reflection on that decision making has shown the motives to be ultimately good motives. From a Kantian deontological ethical framework, one way to think about this is that the actions we take have to be actions that we could will for all people to take at all times, that it's not something just that's for certain people to do and other people don't have access or shouldn't make that kind of decision, and that the actions we take are not using other people merely as a means to an end. And merely becomes an important term there. And that's focused on intentions and motives. Another way to frame our questions around these matters has to do with the kind of people we become. When we make these decisions, when we decide to affirm certain forms of technology for human enhancement, is this shaping us in the kind of character that we have discerned is good character for a human being? Or does it actually direct us away? Or what kinds of things do we need to put in place so that the actions we take or the decisions we make as we move forward in using technology, what do we need to put in place to make sure that we are being formed in ways that are helpful for us as human beings to truly be what we understand human beings to be called to be? Okay. We can talk a little bit more about that later if you have questions about it. But I thought I'd just take a moment and just point out some of the things people are thinking about gene editing. I noticed that some of the questions, actually a good amount, seem to be about how this relates to babies. And it's interesting. That seems to be what's on the minds of a lot of folks who are thinking about it. There was a Pew Research study done in 2016 that looked at a few different things. I have a lot of slides here. I'm not going to show all of them, but I just wanted to show you a few of them. One thing that I think is worth just checking out is that most Americans have heard at least a little bit about gene editing. However, there is a lot of discrepancy. I mean, you've either heard a lot about it, or you've not heard a lot about it. It's not like there's a, let me rephrase that. You've either heard a little bit about it or you've not heard a lot about it. There's not a whole lot of people who are thinking about this on a daily basis. Of course, after yesterday, that might change. Okay? Let me move forward to a couple other things. Those who are familiar with gene editing are more inclined to want it for their child. So this is just public ideas on it. It's also the case that people are very divided on what to do with this. It is true that when you hear about the technology, the first thought is like, oh, wow, that's interesting. Oh, wow, that's pretty cool. But when you get down to some of the deeper questions of what this means, especially when it comes to thinking about what this might mean for babies, it begins to create a lot of questions. There's ultimately a divide in society. There's not a strong pull for or against. So that's just something to think about. I thought I would move forward to say this. Among the 28% of US adults who say gene editing is morally acceptable, many see this concept on a continuum of human betterment. So the idea of accepting it really has to do with whether this is going to make human life better and not just for the sake of developing technology. And there's this idea that, hey, we are already in the work of improving human lives. For those who tend to see this as a positive, the understanding there is, hey, this sounds different, but we've already been at the work of trying to enhance human life. Religious thoughts on gene editing is pretty interesting. In the groups of people who say that it's morally unacceptable to practice gene editing, 1/3 of those who see it as morally unacceptable make their claim on the basis of some religious perspective, and more specifically references to God. What you see are 2 quotes from their focus groups. For example, God is the creator. Messing with DNA is crossing the line. Or we shouldn't be editing what God has created to be perfect in its own way. Of course, those are interesting claims because we are already in the work of human enhancement. We're already seeking to find ways to solve, to heal, to deal with various illnesses and diseases. So some of that reasoning can be questioned in itself. Other not explicitly religious reasons adults say gene editing is morally unacceptable have to do with disrupting nature, wondering if it would be used for bad motives, wondering if there would be these unintended consequences that we haven't really thought about yet, and wondering if it's ultimately unnecessary. And then there were a lot of responses that fall into this 28% of just not being a strong enough mass to really be in a category of its own. So it's just all other responses. Okay. Let me move forward. You have a handout. Most of you have a handout. Someone next to you has a handout if you don't. And it's basically pointing out the significance of white evangelical Protestants in this discussion. So one thing to notice there is within the religious wonders about gene editing, there's also a dynamic that intersects with race. And this is especially because of where people fall in terms of their Christian identity and their church life. But white evangelical Protestants are among the least likely to want gene editing for babies. I don't know if that's surprising to many, but it is important to point out, especially in this context. Also, most white evangelical Protestants say gene editing crosses a line. And that's significant because they stand out as a group that has that perspective that has that perspective in a way that's higher than other religious groups. Let me just take a moment and just ask, is there anyone who's noticing anything on this table here that is interesting to you? I mean, there's a lot to think and talk about there. And all right, I'll let you keep looking at that, and you could let that be a part of the conversation later. One thing to notice is that in the midst of the different ideas of why people are for or against it, it does bring together a few different aspects of these various ethical modes of inquiry. But the reality is that these aren't necessarily Christian ethical questions. These aren't necessarily Christian ethical modes of inquiry. Christians can dialogue with them, but ultimately there's something unique about having faith in this God who makes God's self known through the life, death, resurrection of Jesus, and that the Holy Spirit is sent so that human beings can live holy lives, that there's something significant in our faith around what it means to be human. And as Christians, our ethical questions can go much deeper than, do people want this or do people not want this? Or are we using people as a means to an end or not? I mean, these are good things. Is it shaping us in a particular kind of character? If that character is not connecting with what's at the heart of our faith, those kinds of questions have their limits. But as Christians, we get to ask some particular kinds of questions that connect deeply with our faith. And so we're going to leave you with some of these questions, and then we'll open it up for conversation. So for example, understanding that human beings are created in the image of God, what needs to be put in place to resist versions of human enhancement that abandon what it means to be human? Now, of course, to really get at questions like this, we have to ask, well, what does it mean to be created in the image of God? What does that imply about what it means to be human? Does that have to do with rationality? Does that have to do with community? Does that have to do with capacity for love? Does that have to do with the recognition of others? Does it have to do with being creative beings who can bring about new things? These are all at the heart of the ethical kinds of questions Christians can ask. How might gene editing affect the lives of the least of these? And that comes from Matthew 25:31 through 46. We can talk more about that if you have questions about that. Can gene editing be done in a manner that resists widening the gaps of inequality? If it can be done, how? Like what needs to be done for that to be the case? Can gene editing be done without diminishing the human dignity of people with illnesses or people in marginalized groups? And there we go the route of asking questions about the realities of eugenics and other forms of allowing dominant groups to then set a standard for what it means to be human. Recognizing that we are followers of a Messiah who made God's self known in a community that was seen as not worth considering. What does this then mean for us as we think about what we put in place as what it means to be human and how we practice, our forms of technology? How might gene editing embrace or reject Christian hope for humanity and all of creation? And does the work and embrace of gene editing contribute to or distract from formation in Christian virtues? If so, how? And you can think about Christian virtues in a lot of ways. I put on here what we often call the fruit of the Spirit as an example of Christian virtue. Well, those are just some questions that we thought would leave you with. You have in front of you some examples of how other religious groups are thinking about it. You also got an introduction to CRISPR and gene editing in that conversation. And as we open up the floor, the questions can have to do with the technology itself. It can have to do with ethical inquiry or specifically Christian ethical inquiry. So thank you very much.